All right, today we're going to go ahead and start taking a look at how to move around better in your scene. And I think a great way to do that is actually to sit down and start creating terrains to use in our game. So let's go ahead and start with the actual movement around in our scene. To start off with, I like to use the middle mouse button, just hold it down. And that allows you to pan around in your scene to get to where you want to go. Of course, sometimes if there's a specific thing I want to go to, I'll go ahead and select it in my hierarchy and then just hit F to get in on it and then just zoom in. And zooming in I do with the middle mouse button. For selecting, I generally don't click in my scene too much. If I was trying to, let's say, I don't know, click this, I might accidentally click the fence, or if I'm trying to click the fence, it can be really hard. Not to mention when we start getting child game objects. Sometimes when you're clicking something, you get the child game on. It gets really hard in your scene to click what you want. So I generally just try to keep everything organized and keep it simple enough that I can just go ahead and click what I want to get to. Now to rotate, I hold down Alt and the left mouse button. And of course, between panning and rotating, you can get to anywhere you want. And then, of course, zoom is just the mouse wheel. So to quickly reiterate, selecting, I like to select through the hierarchy. For panning, middle mouse button held down. Rotating, Alt left mouse button. And zooming is mouse wheel in and out. Great. So this is a terrain I made for a game last year for Halloween. And it's one of those things that it just takes a while to get used to. There are a ton of tools out there that'll go ahead and make some really gorgeous looking terrains for you, or at least give you something to start with. And then you can go ahead and modify what they give you. But before you can really start using any of those tools, you kind of have to know how to just work with the default terrain. And that's what we're going to do today. So let's go ahead and create a new project. And I'll do this one from inside of Unity. So I'll go ahead, new project. And I'm just going to go ahead and save this to my desktop because it's just a demo. It's probably nothing I'm going to keep. And I'm just going to call this terrain demo. Out onto the desktop, we'll go ahead, we'll hit choose. I don't care. Oh, we don't even need analytics turned on. I do want to make sure it's 3D. Now, we have not played with any asset packages before. And for this example, we're actually going to add two. I'm going to add one this way, and then I'll add one in game later as well. So to start off with, I'm going to go ahead and add the environments. So right here, I'll go ahead and hit done. Then we'll go ahead and hit create project. It'll run off, go ahead, create that project for us, as well as import that package for me. And here we go. Notice Unity went ahead and loaded up the default settings that we had last time. Well, I guess not default settings, but the settings that we had set up. And we have a couple folders down here. The editor and standard assets. That comes from that environment package that we imported. And we do want another one, and I'm going to show you how to grab it from inside of Unity. So if we go ahead and do import package, I'm going to grab the characters one. Now, before we had a selection of all the packages that we've downloaded and installed on our system before. If you do it this way here, the only ones that show up by default down here will be the ones that come with Unity when you install it. You can go to custom packages to load a custom package that did not come with Unity, but the one we want did. So we're just going to go ahead and select that. Now, doing it this way gives us the option of going ahead and we could select none and then go through and pick the actual ones that we really do want. Or in this case, I'm just going to hit all and just grab all of them. So I'll go ahead, hit import. That'll grab that one in for me. Now we can also grab asset packages from an asset store or an outside source. We'll cover those later. For now, we'll just keep with those two. We've got all the assets we probably need for today. Now before I actually go ahead and start doing anything, I want to save my scene. So I'm going to hit Command S. And I like to save mine in a folder called Scenes. And we could have made this folder here. But since I did before I hit Command S, what I'm going to do is just make sure that I'm in my assets folder here. And I'll go ahead and hit new folder here. I'm going to call it Scenes. And I'm just going to call this Demo 1. And then of course there it is right here. And as I said before, we could just right click and create our folder here. But that's okay. The reason why I wanted to do that was while I'm doing a lot of editing on terrain, it might crash, it might not crash, but I tend to save quite often. And if you come into the file menu, you have the option here to save scene and save scene as, if for some reason you want to make a copy of it. But if you take note up here where you have the actual scene name, if you went ahead and made some edits, for instance, we'll go ahead, we'll add a terrain. You get that little asterisk. That means you have something that hasn't been saved yet. So I'll just go ahead, hit Command S, boom, it runs off, it saves, and I didn't even notice anything happening. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate this. I like my X to point to the right, my Z to point forward. I'm going to shrink this down a bit because I'm not going to need the game view right now. I am going to zoom out a bit. I want to be able to see the whole thing to start off with. There we go. Now when I start working with terrain, since we're all going to be on laptops, one thing you might notice is that you'll get this little blue bar going down here, and what's happening is Unity is going ahead and pre-computing some lighting and everything else. It slows your system down. It's going to cause it to heat up. You're going to get some thermal throttling. It's just going to slow everything down. Let's go ahead and we'll turn that off to start off with. One way we could do it is just go ahead and turn off all the static. The problem with doing that is sometimes not come in and make my navigation meshes or other features that are built into Unity. Sometimes I forget that I have this turned off and it just doesn't work right. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it on. We could just turn off the light map static here. But again, I just generally don't like to play with that toggle up there if it's something that I'm going to be toggling on and off because I always forget. So what I'm actually going to do is come into Window, go to Lighting, and usually it's floating out here. And if it is, just go ahead, drag it in. This is where I usually put it. I also have my navigation window open over here as well. But if we come all the way down to the bottom, we have this auto checked. Go ahead and uncheck it, and you don't have to worry about Unity pre-computing anything or trying to bake any light maps as we work. So let's come back. We'll click onto the inspector, and we're actually ready to start playing with some terrain. So let's go ahead. We've got our transform component. We'll talk about colliders later. For now, all you got to think about is that it's kind of like an invisible wall that we can't get through. But the collider video is coming up later. And let's go ahead and we'll take a look at this terrain component. We'll click on the first tab here, the raise lower terrain. And we have something down here, brushes. And brushes is just the shape that you're going to be working with on your terrain. The brush size is just how big of an area you're going to be working with. So it's pretty small there. A pretty big area here. And opacity gives you a level of control. A low opacity, what we're going to be doing here is raising this terrain. A low opacity means it goes up slowly, where a high opacity means it'll go up really quick. Command Z to undo. We'll go ahead and lower that opacity. And now when I come over, you can't even see. You'd have to actually zoom in to see this. So you see the little waves being put up. And if I raise it a bit, goes up much quicker, right? Now, you can also go ahead and also hold shift. I'm going to lower this down, switch my brush over to something. If you hold shift and paint, you actually paint down. Now take note, you can't paint any lower than what your terrain is set to. So right now our terrain is set to 0. Well, the bottom of the terrain is 0, and you can't paint to a negative number. All right, let's go ahead and look at the next tab here. This is the Paint Height tab, and just like before, we have brushes, we have brush size, we have opacity, but now we have this little height line here. And if we take note here, by default, it's set to 50. I'm going to take a flatter brush here, and if we start painting, we notice how it plateaus off at a certain height. And of course, if you haven't guessed yet, that height is 50. We can go ahead and raise it up a bit. No, let's not go that high, let's do 60. I'm going to go ahead and make my brush size smaller. And look, we can make a plateau inside of a plateau. Oh, I did 600. That's okay. 60. We'll paint it back down. So there you go. Now, if we go ahead and set it to, say, 20 and hit this flatten button, it'll go ahead and flatten everything out. Notice that we're still at 0 on the Y transform. If we back out a bit, come up to the transform tools, go ahead and select one. I should say select the move tool. we notice that it's not actually at the 0 anymore. If we go ahead and put it back down to 0, hit flatten, select the tool, we notice that it does raise, but it's not actually raising on the Y. The transform still stays 0, 0, 0. And that's because it's basically raising it up and plateauing the whole terrain at whatever you set at for 20. So you might be like, well, why would you want to do this? Well, now we can come back into this first tab and we can start doing rivers, caverns, whatever you want. You can now mold it down as well as up. So now you can put your lakes, whatever it is you want around there. Let's go ahead. We'll look at this third tool, but before I do, I'm going to go ahead, make a little choppy area here. There we go. Now we'll come over to this third tool, which is the smooth height. And we have the exact same parameters that we had before, so there's nothing new there. What this tool is for is if we go ahead and lower the opacity down a bit. If we zoom in and take a look, this is just too spiky for what I want. Nothing's going to be able to go over it because it's just too sharp of angles. So if I take something, I want to take something with a smooth edge around it, lower the opacity, I can actually come in and it looks like it's kind of melting it. And it's just taking the very sharp angles and rounding them off a bit. So this is great when you start putting roads or something like that into maybe a mountain or your plateau as you're going up a mountain. You can kind of round off some of those rougher areas. So far, not too bad. Let's go ahead and we'll look at the next tab here, the paint texture one. And for this one here, we have a new property called target strength. But before we do that, let's go ahead and add a couple textures. So we'll click the edit texture button. We'll add a texture. We have this little pop-up here. So for the albedo, we just want the base color for something. Now we can go ahead, click in here and scroll around to find them. As you get more and more textures, sometimes you'll want to search for them. So let's do a dirt. Nothing in dirt. Sand. There is a sand. But sometimes if you just know what texture you want, it's easier just to drive down and find it. So I'm going to come into the texture assets, the surface textures. And I'm going to take this sand albedo, drag it in there. I will do the normal next, and we'll play around with these other values a little bit later on. Now the first texture you add to your terrain is going to cover the complete terrain. It's your base layer. So if we go ahead and we'll select it, we notice it shows up here. And whatever one is active, when we add another one, you can have this little blue bar beside it. So let's add another texture. This time we'll add one with a normal. So let's go for this mud rock albedo. And for those that aren't familiar with normal maps, sometimes they're called bump maps. I'm sure you've played a game maybe where you're looking at a concrete wall. And while you're looking at the wall, it looks like it's all bumpy and dimply. It has that concrete texture look to it. It looks like it has more polygons than just a regular flat wall. But maybe as you start getting closer and closer to the wall and you're looking at it at a fairly sharp angle, you notice that the wall itself is actually flat. It doesn't actually have any bump to it. Well, that's what your normal map is actually doing. It's faking that bumpiness to it. So it makes that wall look like it has more polygons than it does. Then of course metallic, let's say you're I don't know, you got a mountain, you want to add some gold texture to the side of it. You can go ahead and crank it up to make it shiny. And when we get into more advanced texturing, we'll go ahead and we'll take a look at the sizing and offsetting. So we'll go ahead, we'll hit add. Select my texture again. It might take a second for it to load it and get everything ready. So if we select it, we notice we get the blue bar. I'm going to keep the values I have now. Target strength, we go ahead and crank that right down. I'm going to zoom in on an area. Let's say right here, and we try to paint. Nothing's happening because it has a target strength of 0. If we're cranking up just a little bit, let's crank it up, well, not quite that much. And we start painting, we'll get a faint look of it. And of course, as we keep going over it, nothing's happening. So right now I'm at about 20% of the texture. So it's blending 20% of the current texture that I've selected with, with the texture that it has behind it. So you're getting 80% of the sand texture, 20% of the mud rock. Let's crank this up a bit more. And we'll start painting. And of course, you get a bit more, but it never gets any higher than the 52.5%. And of course, you can also crank it right up. And now you can get to the full 100. And we'll notice it looks bumpy. But when you look at it, it's not bumpy. Right? Looks like it has some texture. Look at it at a sharper angle. No texture. It's flat. So there we go. Let's go ahead. Let's add a couple more textures. I usually like to have some sort of grass texture that I want to paint in. Just going to go ahead, add that, and I'll go ahead and add one more. I'll do it through here. Let's go for the grass rock. There we go. So I'm going to come over to, I don't know, let's go right in this section here. I'm going to go ahead and paint some grass texture. We'll leave it on 100%. And I don't mind if I get up on the little mountain ledge here. Well, it's not really a mountain, the hill ledge. I'm going to be painting over that in a second. So there we go. I'll zoom in. I'm just going to work on this little area just for demonstration purposes. I encourage you to actually sit down and create some actual different pieces of landmass, as it actually does become very fun later on. So I'm going to go ahead and select this fourth one I've selected. I'm going to bring my brush size down. I'm going to lower the target strength just a bit and lower the opacity. And I'm just going to go ahead, paint up here. And I'm not worried about the back here. For now, I'm only worried about this area here. There we go. So I've got a little area painted up. Great. Let's move on to that next tab. The next tab has two little trees, and of course, it's the Place Tree tab. Now, right now, it doesn't look like it has any options, but that environment pack that we included has a few trees in it. So when we go ahead and open it up, it looks a little bit different. The trees that we grabbed are from a speed tree kit, or from the program speed tree. So we'll go ahead and import them. All of the properties of that tree is held within the actual asset itself. If you're going to go ahead and just freehand 3D trees in a modeling package and import them, you do have the option to set bend factors on them. So when you have a breeze, how much does this tree bend? But since we're working with speed trees today, we're going to end up losing that option as soon as we select them. So like before, we can go ahead and hit this little target. There's a few here. Let's see if I can actually find them in here. Oh, here they are, speed tree. So it looks like we have three different ones: the broad, the conifer, and the palm. I'm just going to grab two for now, so I'll grab the desktop version of broadleaf. We'll go ahead, we'll add it, and while it's loading it up, I'll add another one. There we go. And let's just take a quick look at these two while we have them. So here we are with the desktop thumbnail and the actual asset itself. Now, I've actually never used the speed tree program. Last time I looked, it was a monthly fee, and there's so many trees available on the asset store already that are either free or just not that expensive. I just always end up just using those. I'm sure someday I'll want to go ahead and have my own custom world with maybe custom shaped trees and whatnot, and then I'll grab it. But for now, I've just been grabbing the stuff on the asset store. But you do have access to all of the different properties here. So let's go ahead, we'll select our terrain. I'll go ahead and select the first one, the broadleaf desktop. And let's go down, the brush size we've seen before, tree density. Well, brush size, of course, is just how much area we affect at once. The tree density is how many trees we're going to place into that area that we're affecting. The tree height, the lock width to height, and the tree width all control, well, basically the size of the tree. I always like to leave it random. Of course, you can turn it off, and all your trees will be a certain height and width. I usually like to leave it random, and you get this little, I'm not sure what the real name is. I call it a pill slider. And you can go ahead and set a range. Now, I wish we had some numbers here so I could see maybe set it up to be 0.8 to 1.2. If there is a way to show that in Unity, by all means, let me know down in the comments. It's something I haven't been able to figure out. Now, I always like to leave the lock width and height so that everything's scaled proportionally. Depending on the world you're creating, maybe you want your trees to be like really fat or really skinny. It's completely up to you. And then this random tree rotation, again, I always leave that on. I'm sure everyone's played a game where they're running through a forest and every tree's in the exact same rotation, exact same angle. This varies it up a bit, as well as speed tree adding a little bit of color to each of them. So you can use the same trees over and over and over again, and it doesn't get monotonous to run around in. So with all that done, I'm just going to come in and go ahead and paint some broadleafs. And then inside of there, I'm going to go ahead, paint some conifers. Whoop, that was too many. Let's go ahead, Command Z, undo. I'm actually going to lower the density on this one and increase the tree size. Just hit the button once. That's about what I want. So it's not too bad. It's a nice little area I got going there. Now there is one other tree I wanted to take note of here. Let's go ahead and actually undo my trees. Now you can hit Command Z to undo, just like you do with all the other actions you perform in a game. Or you can just hit Shift and unpaint all the trees. So mass place tree. We'll go ahead, we click that. By default, it's going to say how many number of trees you want to put down. I don't want to put that many. Let's go 500. And keep existing trees. So the trees that I already had there, I didn't have to erase them. I could have just unchecked this and it would have not included those trees that I already had. It would have removed them and then put 500 more down. Or if you've already got trees down, you can go ahead and choose to keep them. So I'm going to go ahead and hit place. And there we go. It went ahead and placed 500 trees, mixturing the trees that I have loaded up here. I only have the 2. Now there is no logical placement. It's not going to be like, oh, you've got water over here, I'm going to put palm trees or anything like that. It's just going to randomly place them around, but it will not place trees up on sharp angles. So it would never place a tree up on, one of these edges here because it's just too sharp. It knows that it's not supposed to be there. But a lot of times I'll go ahead and do something like this if I'm going to be playing, if I'm going to be creating a game that I know is going to have a lot of forested area. And I'd rather just start with a nice random selection of trees to start off with. And then I'll come in and just go ahead, shrink the brush down. And maybe I'm going to paint some roads or something like that. That's too small, obviously. If I'm going to be painting my roads or whatnot into it, I'll just go ahead and remove them as need be. And then maybe if I remove too much, I can go ahead and just paint them in small batches or paint them in individually a little bit later on. So I need to increase my density. There we go. And just paint them in individually as I need. But there's lots of options to play with here. Try not to get too crazy with trees. You want your players to be able to move through your forest. You don't want your players to constantly be running around and getting stuck because 2 or 3 trees formed an area that they just couldn't get through. Unless, of course, that's your goal, is to maybe make a wall where they can't get through there. Basically setting up your boundary maybe for this zone. But that's really all there is to placing trees. Let's go ahead and move on to grass. So we'll go ahead, we'll click that last tab here. And we have no new options here, so let's go jump right in. We'll go ahead and we're going to work with grass textures right now. So we'll go ahead and it looks completely different than the trees, but it's not that hard. We have min width, min height, max height. The real important ones is just the colors here. So the grass that comes with Unity I find to be too tall. I always end up shortening it. And of course making it a little bit skinnier. You basically play around, season it to taste. By default, I'm just going to leave it here. Now healthy color, dry color. As you're painting your grass onto your terrain, it'll go ahead and go slightly blend through like healthy color and a drier color for your grass. And it just adds a nice effect so that not every patch of grass is the exact same color. So we'll go ahead. I'm going to click on that. Again, we have a ton of different options. I'm just going to go ahead and type in grass. Of course, you could drill down to the texture you want. Now take note, just type it in grass. I've got 4 different types here. You don't want to take the ones that say albedo or that are just big squares. You want to take the ones that actually have a shape to them. For instance, I'll go ahead and take this one. We'll put it in. If you take the ones with just a big square, it's going to put those squares around on your screen. You need that alpha so you can actually see through it. So we'll go ahead, we'll hit A. Oh, there's one thing I wanted to point out that I missed. Is you want to make sure that it's billboard. And what that does is, this is just a texture. It's only one side that you can see this from. So as the camera moves around, it kind of rotates around with the camera, so you're always looking at the same side. It's not a 3D object. So we'll go ahead, we'll take that, we'll go into the little area that I wanted to play around in, and zoom in a bit, and just start painting. Now as you zoom in and out, the grass disappears for performance reasons. And you might not want to get too crazy with the grass. A lot of people tend to put a lot of grass out and it just legs the game out. So I'm just going to put that patch down there, and we can see a little bit of the changing of the colors that goes through. I'm going to put a little bit more down. And then of course, just like with the trees, you can go ahead and hold shift and unpaint it. And then we can also actually add 3D meshes as well. Detailed mesh. I generally almost never use this option because I don't like the way everything behaves. But let's go ahead and see if we have any in here. Not see anything in here. I guess it does not come with any bushes. Well, I don't want to cover the asset store yet, but if you had some bushes, you can go ahead and throw them in here. These are actual 3D models in your game instead of just using the 2D texture. I almost always just use the 2D texture. So we'll come back to this after we've explored the asset store. Now with all that done, let's go ahead and add our player to it. So we can come in, I'm going to move this over a bit so I can see a bit better. We have the characters, first person controller. We're going to go to the prefabs folder. And this first person controller, the first one, I just want to take it, drag it into my scene somewhere. And we notice it shows up here. It's blue. That means it's attached to a prefab. I'm going to go ahead, select it, hit F to zoom in on it. And if you notice, it has a little green capsule around it. You want to make sure that's above the ground. Now, from where I have it positioned, it's kind of hard to see. Let's go ahead. We'll move this over to an area where the grass is not so high. So we'll go ahead. We'll zoom in. There we go. Now we can see this capsule a little bit better. So just take it, move it up. You just want it above the ground. If it's below the ground, it's going to fall through that collider and we're just going to fall through the earth. And we'll just keep falling. So just make sure it's above it. And of course, if we open this up, it has a child game object attached to it. And this child game object has a camera attached to it already. So let's go ahead and grab this main camera. I'm actually just going to delete it. I do not need it anymore, as we have the one here. So let's go ahead, hit play. And let's actually go ahead and maximize on play. So if we click this button here, when we go to hit the play button, it'll actually go ahead and maximize. There's a couple of ways we can hit that play button. We can click on it, which is the way I just did now. Let me go ahead and mute my sound. And we can go ahead and run around, explore our world. See, I don't like the grass. It's a little too tall. But you can go ahead and play with those settings. I'll show you how to edit them in just a second. But to get our mouse back, there's a couple of ways we can do it. We can either hit escape, which will give us our pointer back, and we can come up and hit the play button, or you can just hit Command P, which will toggle you in and out of play mode. So as far as editing the grass, I think I just showed it, but just to make sure that I did cover it, go ahead and select whatever it is you want to grab, hit edit, and then edit. And you can go ahead and update stuff. So shrink the grass down, do whatever it is that you need to do to get the look and feel for the terrain that you want. And that brings us to the last tab. And there's really only one thing at this point that I want to go over in this last tab. Since we're going to be using this stuff in class, I want to keep the terrain sizes themselves pretty small. I don't want to sit there when we're playing with light maps or navigation meshes, having to sit there and wait for minutes for everything to bake for us. So if we come down here under the resolution settings, we notice that the default is 500 by 500 by 600. When you're working on your projects at home for the stuff that, well, you're not bringing to class, feel free to make these bigger. But for the stuff that we're going to be working on in class, let's make sure that it's no bigger than this. In some of the examples that we'll do, we'll probably actually go ahead and make it smaller. But that's it as far as the train engine goes. There's a few other things we have to cover, like adding water and that, but it has nothing to do with the actual train engine itself. So I want to keep that in its own separate video. But there you go. Go ahead, make some nice trains. Go ahead, add some trenches, which we can add water to a little bit later on, maybe some mountainous areas. Let's see how good you can get with the molding tools.